Hey everybody, Rob here at eTrailer.com, and today we're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings Front Rebel Helper Springs on our 2019 Coachmen Mirada Motorhome. Here at eTrailer.com, we get a lot of questions about motorhomes, specifically about suspension upgrades. Because let's face it, whether you're new to driving a motorhome or you've been doing it for a while, you'll realize real quickly that they're very top heavy and altogether just a very large vehicle. And once you start driving, you notice all the little things that are going on. You kind of feel that swaying feeling going on. It kind of feels a little bit loose in the steering wheel. Well, that can be unnerving for a lot of people because how big it is, we don't really feel like we're in quite as much control as we want. Not to mention, if we have a dip in the road, the steering wants to pull us to the side, we end up fighting that steering wheel. Well, even if you're not driving and you're in the back of the motorhome, well, you're probably getting tossed around and it's not that enjoyable. So all those little things really add up over time, and by the time we get to our destination, we're going to be exhausted from either moving in our seat, trying to get comfortable, fighting the steering wheel, and just trying to keep our motorhome straight and tracking the way it should. So before we put any kind of suspension components on our motorhome, we're going to take it on our test course and see how it handles the way it is now. Immediately feel a really big body roll. It's almost like the motorhome wants to lean and then go into the turn. Now on the bumps course here, that softness kind of goes away because once we hit the bump, it's not an extremely hard bump, but you can feel it kind of going through the seat, resonating through the floor. But what I really think the problem is not necessarily the bump itself, more of the after effect. We go over the bump and I can feel the motorhome kind of still hopping around and it doesn't want to react as quick. And then especially when we come to the alternating speed bumps here, it kind of lurches to one side and then lurches back the other way. Again, I'm really just have to make sure I have a firm grip and paying attention to what's going on because the motorhome's kind of wanting to go where it wants to go and I have to fight it. And even just driving through the parking lot with some of the uneven pavement and little potholes that are around, you definitely can feel that. But again, because of how soft it is, it's not really a problem there. It's just more of a control issue. And as we're going through the parking lot here, I'm just idling. And as I turn the steering wheel back and forth, we're still traveling straight, but you can actually see the entire windshield shifting and how much roll it actually has to it. But now that we got our parts installed, let's take our motorhome back on our test course and see how everything improved. Now, as I come up to my slalom course, again, we'll be running about 10 miles an hour to try to keep it as close to that baseline run as we had. I can already feel a difference just going through the parking lot, and honestly, as I come in and out of the turns, it doesn't feel like it's swaying anywhere near as much. It does feel a lot more planted. And it's just a lot easier to go in and out of the turns. I'm not having to grab the steering wheel and rip it back to come back to center. It just naturally kind of wants to ease in and out of the turns. It's a lot more comfortable. I just feel like I have a lot more control. Now as I come up to my bumps course, again, we're running about 5 miles an hour just to keep a nice baseline. But I can hardly tell a difference. Don't get me wrong, the bumps are still there, obviously. But they're not as jarring. I'm not really getting that coming through the seat. Not to mention, once we get over the bump, the motorhome just kind of wants to level out and not continue to bounce. And that's really the biggest thing. Which that's really the point of all of our suspension upgrades, is so that we can drive our motorhome, have the confidence, and actually enjoy it rather than being nervous. So I can definitely tell a difference between the before and the after. Because again, it's all about the feeling that we get whenever we're driving our motorhome so we can confidently get where we're going. And again, not have to fight that steering wheel, keep adjusting in our seat, and actually be able to enjoy it rather than making it a stressful situation. One thing I do want to mention is we did put on several different suspension components, and that's what I would suggest anyway. If you're going to be doing the front or the back, you might as well do both so we can get the most stability out of our motorhome all the way from the front of it to the back so we don't have to worry about any of those problems that may arise. So we actually ended up putting on front SumoSprings along with rear SumoSprings, the front steering stabilizer, and the rear sway bar. So all those things combined together are going to give us all those results that we did see on our test course. So here's what our SumoSprings are going to look like once we have them installed. Now the way they're going to help us out is because they're going to mount in between the frame and our front axle, and they're going to provide us that cushion whenever we have all that extra weight up front. Now the extra weight could just be because we have a slide out or anything else, and it's going to cause all that weight. Because once we have that slide out on the front, not only are we wanting our front suspension to hold up the motorhome, but we're also wanting it to hold all the gear, the slide out, and everything else on top of it. Now our SumoSprings are going to replace our factory joust stops. Now you can see when our joust stops are bolted up to the frame, you can see there's quite a bit of a gap here. So you can see just by having the extra large space, it's going to give us that much more support because it's going to be in contact all the time. Our factory joust stop really is just there to prevent the frame from hitting the axle, because you can see again quite how much space there is. So if it did ever come down that far, it's already traveled too far and we're going to end up bottoming out. Our SumoSprings are going to prevent that because they're going to give us that cushion, preventing the frame from coming down that far. Now our springs are going to be made out of a microcellular urethane. So they're also going to absorb a lot of the road shocks when we're driving down the road. So not only are they going to help give us the support, but they're also going to give us a nice comfortable ride. Now we are going to have a spring on each side of our axle, so they're going to work independent from each other, which is going to help out a lot when it comes to body roll. Whether we take a sharp turn or we get a big gust of wind that comes by, one side typically wants to go down, so the spring will compress, and it's going to prevent it from coming down too hard and too fast, so we won't get as much body roll. Really going to set our front springs apart to other types of suspension upgrades is going to be the two-piece design. Our upper section of our spring here is actually going to be a separate piece from the lower piece, which means it's going to help out a lot on the rebound. Whenever you go over a bump, you're going to have that initial collapse of the suspension where it wants to squish down, but then naturally it's going to want to spring back and rebound and go up. The fact that we have two separate pieces means we're not going to be limited on our suspension travel, so we can go over those bumps and not bottom out going upward. Now looking at the springs, you may think that it's going to be a pretty rough ride because it's connected between the bottom and the top and there's not that much give there. But our springs have a progressive rate to them, which means that when we don't have a lot of force or downward pressure or weight on them, they're going to engage softly and we can absorb a lot of those road shocks and just be a comfortable ride. But the harder they get pressed on or the more weight we put on them, the stiffer they're going to become, providing that much more support. So we don't have to worry about it being rough because again, normal ride it'll engage softly, but the heavier and more stress we put on it, the stiffer it becomes. But they're also going to expand vertically and not expand too much outward. They're not going to swell out, so we don't have to worry about any nearby components getting in the way. Our springs are going to have a 2,600 pound weight capacity at 50% compression. Now you just want to keep in mind these are not going to increase the capacity of our motorhome. Again, they're just there to help out with the extra weight, give us some support, and absorb those bumps and shocks so we can comfortably get down the road and have the confidence and not have so much white-knuckle driving. One thing I really like about our springs is once we have them installed, they're going to be completely maintenance-free. We're not going to have to worry about any kind of maintenance, unlike some other suspension upgrades like airbags, where the installation is going to be a little bit more in-depth. We are going to have to run air lines and monitor the airbags to make sure we have the appropriate pressure in them. But with our SumoSprings, we can install them and just enjoy our motorhome and not really have to think about it. And I do realize that a lot of people do not have a lift at home to lift up the motorhome to get these installed, but this is definitely something you can actually do right in your driveway, and we'll give you a few tips and tricks of how to get everything in place without ever having the tires off the ground. In fact, let's go ahead and do that together now. To start out your install, you want to make sure you park your motorhome on a nice flat level surface, put your parking brake on, make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Now, I realize that not everybody at home has anything large enough to lift their motorhome up, but we can actually get the entire installation done with all of the tires still on the ground. We do, however, want to use our leveling jacks just to raise the front up. We don't need to lift the tires off the ground. We just want that suspension to stretch so we have some more room to work with, and then we can move underneath the front right by the front axle. So we're over on the driver's side, just right above the front axle here, and if we look up, we'll find our factory joust stop on the bottom of the frame. At the very bottom of it, we're going to have a hole, and that's what the bolt holding it to the frame is going to be going through. You want to grab yourself a 13mm socket and an extension, and we need to pull the joust stop out. We'll go through the bottom. I always like to just break that bolt loose. Get it nice and loose. However, it's not going to come off just like that, because if we look on the inside of the frame here, there's actually a nut holding everything in. So we want to make sure we grab a 15mm wrench and hold the nut still while we loosen up the bolt from the bottom. Once we have it removed, we want to hold on to all the hardware, but we can get rid of the spring itself. At this point, we want to grab the upper section of our spring out of the packaging. Now we'll know it's the upper section because most likely you'll have a bracket that's already bolted to it, and it'll have a larger opening on the bottom. We need to remove the bracket, so we'll loosen up these two bolts. And once they're all the way loose, we can lift it off the spring itself. And we want to make sure we leave these bolts going down through the bracket just like this, because we're going to take it, and the hole in the center is where our bolt's going to come through and bolt it up to the frame. We just want to make sure that these tabs here are towards the center of the vehicle, going away from the tire, and it's going to sit nice and flat up against the frame. But we want to make sure we have these bolts in place, because once it's against the frame, it'll actually be pretty tight and nearly impossible to get these bolts in. So before you put this bracket underneath the frame, make sure that they're dropping through and hanging down like this. Little tabs here on the inside of the frame. Line up the hole with the factory hole. You just loosely hold it in place. Take the factory bolt, pass it back through the mounting hole. And we'll take our nut. And we want to get it at least loosely started so the bracket won't fall. We're going to want to thread this on and tighten it up so the bracket's nice and secure against the frame. We'll grab that same 13mm socket and a 15mm wrench and tighten all the bolts back up. And if the bracket did move while you're tightening it up, that's alright. We can always just loosen it up a little bit. Make sure the bracket's sitting nice and square, and then tighten it up. So now we're going to grab that upper section of our spring that we had on earlier. Again, the large opening, we have 4 threaded holes in top. 2 of the threaded holes are going to line up with the bolts that are passing down through. So you just kind of want to loosely get them lined up, lift it up, and then you want to just take your finger and get a couple threads to get that spring to start. Make sure the bolt's not cross-threading, and once you get a couple threads on there, you should be able to kind of pivot it to get the other one started so that the spring can kind of just hold itself up. Now again, there's very limited room here to get a wrench or socket or anything in there, but we need to tighten up our bolts. So what I suggest is if you have a ratcheting wrench, there's just enough room to get your ratcheting wrench in there and start the bolt and start tightening it up. However, you do want to alternate going back and forth, because if we have one bolt that goes up too high too quick, you can get your wrench trapped. But we want to go back, tighten up both the bolts so they're nice and snug and tight against the bottom of that bracket. So then we want to grab our lower bracket, the lower section of our spring, and a 3/8 flange bolt. Now if we're looking at our bracket, both the brackets are going to be identical. We'll have 2 holes that are slotted in the center of it. We'll have a kind of a tall section that has a notch. That needs to go towards the front of our motorhome. And then on the back side, we'll have a little taper with 2 square holes. Again, that's going to be going towards the back. Now, depending on which side you're mounting your spring, we're on the driver's side, so we want to make sure we're using the inner hole. It's going to be the same on both sides. You just want to use that inner hole. The large notched section is going to go towards the front. So we'll take our spring, flip it over. We're going to line up that single threaded hole with the inner hole on our bracket. We'll take our 3/8 flange bolt, and now we just want to get it real loosely in there by hand. You want plenty of movement in the spring so you'll be able to slide it back and forth. take our spring assembly and we want to set it right on top of our leaf spring pack so that the spring is going to be sitting directly underneath the upper section. Now you can see why we wanted to leave that piece loose, because we wanted to make sure that it lines up properly. There's a couple different ways you can do that. You can either just kind of eyeball it, mark your spring and the plate, then you can remove the assembly, or if you have enough room, you can sneak in a wrench underneath the opening right here and tighten it up. But either way, we want to get our springs lined up, make sure that that notch is going around the leaf spring, it's sitting properly, and then we want to tighten up that bolt on the bottom so the spring will not move back and forth. Once the spring's nice and secure on the lower bracket, we want to grab the long carriage bolts out of our kit. There are going to be two different sizes. We'll have some shorter ones and some long ones. The long ones are going to go into the two square holes that are going to be in the front side of our lower bracket here. Just want to drop them down. Make sure that little square on the top engages the hole. We'll do that for both of the front holes. Make sure it goes all the way down, drops down to the bracket. Now on the back side, we're also going to have two square holes, and that's where our shorter carriage bolts are going to go through. Just make sure you put them in the correct spot. So the short ones are going to go towards the back, the long ones go towards the front. So now we want to grab the clamps that are in our kit. Now they're going to be kind of a U or an N shape, depending on how you're looking at it. When we put them in place, you want to make sure that the tabs or ears or the sides of them are facing up. And we'll line up the carriage bolts that we just put in with the two holes that are dropping down through. Now right in this area on the front side of the axle, there is a very limited space because we got our sway bar and the actual axle itself. But if we grab the carriage bolt, we can kind of lift it up, kind of help guide it into the hole to make it a little bit easier to get everything started. Make sure we do that for both of our carriage bolts, lining up the holes, have them come all the way down through. And then once you have the bolts passing through the bracket, you want to grab a 3/8 flange nut. And we're just going to loosely put it onto our carriage bolts so that bracket won't fall off. Now this is going to be the same combination of hardware and direction everything is going to be facing for the other carriage bolts on the back side of our axle as well. Now again, this is pretty tight fit in here, so it may be easier to lift the carriage bolt up so you can actually spin the bolt rather than the nut inside of here. And once you have all your nuts loosely in place, we want to grab a 9/16 socket and we'll start snugging them up. One thing you do need to be mindful of though is if we actually push too hard on the carriage bolt, the little head will come out and it'll just start spinning freely and it won't tighten up. So you want to make sure you might have to push down on the top of the carriage bolt and then tighten it up, but you also want to alternate between the two so we get an even clamping force as you tighten it. And again, it's going to be the same size for the carriage bolts on the front, so we're going to tighten those up in an alternating pattern as well. But that'll finish up the installation on this side. All we got to do is repeat that same process over on the passenger side. Now over here on the passenger side, everything is going to be identical, except the initial removal of our joust stop. You can see here the frame is actually boxed off, and we're not going to have access to get to the nut. But that's okay, because they actually welded the nut to the bottom of the frame here, so all we really need is that 13mm socket to pull it out, and we don't have to worry about holding the nut because it's going to be welded in place. So you're still going to use that bolt to mount your bracket, but we're just not going to have to hold the nut with a wrench. But with all that being said, again, I'm Rob here at eTrailer.com, and that'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings Rebel Helper Springs for the front axle on our 2019 Coachmen Mirada Motorhome.